Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our catch-up evening on what's up with the 413 and all of our plans and working together to make sure it never gets built. I'm Tim Gray. I'm the Executive Director of Environmental Defense. And tonight, before we get started, I'd just like to spend a moment just reminding ourselves where we are. And I'll do a land acknowledgement. And I'm in Toronto, which is the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. But many of you are calling in from other locations, so I encourage you to introduce yourself and where you're calling in from in the chat, which I see people are already doing that. Of course, Highway 413 itself will primarily impact the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Wendat. And of course, they have submitted their own comments on the recently canceled federal impact assessment, which we're going to dive into more tonight. Joining me this evening is Phil Pothen, who's our Program Manager, Land Use and Ontario Environment and Council. And he's been on our team fighting back against Big Sprawl and has also been working with us to dig into the details of how we can push back and stop Highway 413. And he's going to speak to some of the issues here tonight as well. I just want to start right at the beginning with kind of introducing what we're going to cover this evening. If we could move to the next slide. The one after that. Yeah, thank you. So this is just a snapshot of our agenda this evening. But so what we're going to try and cover here is just to give you a bit of a background and try and clear up some of the confusion of what's been in the media recently around the status of impact assessment on Highway 413, what that means in terms of federal responsibility around that. Also have a look at some of the other areas of federal responsibility around environmental review of this proposed highway. Speak a little bit about the provincial process, and then dive into ways that we can all take action together. But just before I turn it over to Phil, who's going to dive into some of these details, maybe just a little bit of a kind of a brief overview of where things are at. You might recall that a few months ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the Federal Impact Assessment Act was unconstitutional in some areas. And so the federal government immediately acknowledged that and said that they would redraft the portions of the act that were found to be non-compliant. And basically that involves what the court thought was like intervention of the federal government into provincial areas of responsibility. But clearly, the court also said that the federal government has jurisdiction over areas of responsibility that are its legislative areas of authority. So that includes things like federally listed species at risk, Indigenous rights and rights to consultation and having a say over big projects like highways like this, migratory birds, fish, etc. So what they've said they're going to do is go off and redraft a new legislation. So that's kind of where we're at. The Ontario government, of course, took advantage of this situation, brought a lawsuit against the federal government to seek immediate cancellation of the highway. And the federal government, to avoid that going to court on that issue, which was imminent, decided to reach an agreement to defer the assessment, or at least that's our view on it, until such time that they can bring in a new legislation. And Phil will dive into that in more detail. But as you'll see in the conversation tonight, we think the media coverage around this, saying that the federal government has completely abandoned responsibility and a role in this highway and has approved it, is entirely false. And I think we'll be able to illustrate that. And no better person to do that than Phil Pothen, who's our legal counsel, and obviously with that title knows a little bit about the law. So he will dive into this, and then I'll follow up on some of the issues related to other aspects of federal responsibility. Take it away, Phil.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. So just to start out, there's some little overlap in what I'm going to introduce today. So known for months that current actually needs to be continued and under the promised update impact assessment act. We always knew that was going to happen. That is, but because impact assessment ended before the.
Phil, we can't really hear you. Your voice is breaking up.
Okay. After so many voice tests too. Okay, let's because the impact assessment ended before the new one was in place, there's a temporary gap in Impact Assessment Act protection. This temporary gap, the suspension of the old impact assessment or the removal of the old impact assessment is the MOU deal that the Ontario government is pitching, and talking about, but it only applies to the old impact assessment that we always knew would have to go away, would have to be or removed and replaced with a new one. It remains the case that Canada has the power and the obligation to close that temporary gap to prevent Ontario from destroying at risk in the interim. But because of some of the misinformation that's being spread and just some of the push that we're seeing from the government, it's going to be very important to push government MPs in particular really hard to make sure that they keep their promise of new muscular impact assessment and designate Highway 413 for impact assessment rather than switching sides and letting it go ahead under the guise of relying on provincial protection. Next slide. Tim, did you want us to help the bandwidth or something? I don't know. Or maybe I'll. Okay. I'm good. So isn't there already an impact assessment? The impact assessment has been the main meaningful environmental protection since May of 2021. That's because most provincial protections, like environmental assessment and Endangered Species Act, have really been gutted. Any proper environmental assessment and endangered species protection at the provincial level would impose whatever conditions are required to prevent any harm to species at risk or their habitat from 413. It would be aimed at preventing impact rather than merely minimizing it with the current route and plan. But there is, and because there's no prospect of building Highway 413 across the current without massive harm to species at risk in particular, because the Highway 413 route is like a big red line that runs through the habitat and the species of Shiner in particular are endangered species, as well as it's an area called the Peel Plain. If there were a proper environmental protection law in Ontario of any sort, then the Ontario government itself wouldn't be able to move forward. Ontario's process is plainly structured not to impose any major change to the route, let alone any major changes that could make 413 inviable to build. And Ontario is now laying the groundwork to further weaken that by shifting highway assessments to a list-based approach, which would essentially be a checklist and would really mean no provincial environmental assessment at all. Federal designation of Highway 413, by contrast, under the Impact Assessment Act, it banned any 413 related destruction affecting fish habitat, aquatic species, federally listed species at risk, migratory birds, federal lands, Indigenous cultural heritage, and other key federal interests from the time that the designation happened until the disposition of the designation. And our expectation is that the conditions resulting from any federal impact will be compatible with the project moving forward on its current route. Said known time that current impact assessment would need to be discontinued and reinstated. The Supreme Court of Canada, in my opinion, found that there were technical problems with the word. Not go to say no to development, destroy endangered species, did not go to the substance of Canada's ability to freeze any forward movement on Highway 413 for the duration of the impact assessment. The changes that the Supreme Court required are really easy to make and can be made in ways that allow for a quick designation of 413 and a very thorough impact assessment. And the federal government has promised a new act this spring, as Tim suggested. So if we go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So why is there a temporary gap in federal protection now? Well, Ontario wanted to create a temporary gap. While the Supreme Court, contrary to what some might think, it did not strike down the Impact Assessment Act, nor did it strike down the federal impact assessment designation of Highway 413. But the provincial government, rather than waiting for Canada to be able to fix the problems that the Supreme Court identified, was trying to take advantage by using the Supreme Court opinion to strike down the act for the new one put in place, strike down the designation as well. Now, even there, Canada did make a mistake. We were a little unhappy with what they did because they let that litigation about that judicial review application, it's called. I'm very sorry, folks. I'm going to pause this just for a sec. I think I have an idea of what may be causing these issues, so just give me a moment. I'm hoping it's better now, but we will see. So why is there a temporary gap in federal protection now? Canada let its litigation with Ontario end too soon. They consented to an order discontinuing the impact assessment, and they didn't really argue procedural problems that were raised by environmental defense when we gained the intervener status in this litigation. In particular, we think that Canada should have pointed out that Ontario brought this application to the wrong court and that it sought the wrong remedy, and it should have forced Ontario to go back to the drawing board and bring a new JR application, so it would take longer and there would be time to get the new Impact Assessment Act in place. But in the end, this agreement, this deal to suspend the current impact assessment very clearly reserved Canada's right to redesignate under the new Impact Assessment Act. You could change slide, please. Canada can and must start a new 413 impact assessment. And the Memorandum of Understanding with the Ontario government, the deal with the Ontario government, doesn't change that in the least. The Memorandum of Understanding clearly reserves the federal government's right to designate 413 again under an updated Impact Assessment Act. Expressly says that nothing in this Memorandum of Understanding will prejudice the implementation of either party's jurisdiction or legislative authorities or fetter the discretion of any statutory decision maker. There is nothing here, contrary to what Ontario would claim, that says that Canada can't or won't redesignate under the new Impact Assessment Act. And that is verified by Canada's response to all questions about impact assessment following this deal. It does not say we are not going to designate Highway 413. On the contrary, it says the federal government is committed to presenting legislation to update the Impact Assessment Act in spring 2024, and that no decisions on designating projects will be taken until the amended legislation is enforced. So this is directly contradicting the federal government's claim that Canada has, or the provincial government's claim that the federal government has agreed not to designate. Any refusal to redesignate would have nothing to do with litigation or any leverage that the Ontario government had. In this circumstance, it would be a willful breach of federal responsibilities, which we think would be an absurd and politically suicidal move by the federal government. It would implicate the federal government in the provincial 413 scandal. If you go to the next slide, please. So here's what Canada, the federal government, has to do now, practically speaking. First, Canada must pass quickly an updated Impact Assessment Act. And that act should retain the power to designate all aspects of 413 impact federal jurisdiction for thorough federal assessment. That's one thing you should look for. It should allow designation of Highway 413 even if Ontario claims somehow that, oh, we've awarded some contracts, oh, we've already destroyed some of the habitats and fish habitats in particular, or even that they've claimed to have started building some symbolic parts of 413. And the new Impact Assessment Act should clearly prohibit further destruction as soon as 413 has been redesignated and until the disposition of the impact assessment. So it has to happen quickly. It can't just wait in perpetuity. Ideally, what we'd like to see is some version of the Impact Assessment Act legislation introduced as part of the implementation legislation for the current budget, because that will allow it to get passed quickly, as early as June, we would hope. And we would hope then that would allow a quick designation. And it's very important in the meantime to strictly, even if that doesn't happen, it doesn't mean that there won't be a designation. It's just that's the ideal. But in the meantime, it's vital, and Tim's going to dig in here, to strictly enforce all the other federal laws to prevent or minimize damage during the temporary gap in Impact Assessment Act protection. If we just change slides, please. In order to make sure that this actually happens, as we all have every right to expect that it will, as any sense of loyalty to Ontarians would require the federal government to do, we really are going to have to keep up the pressure on federal government MPs. That's because the Ontario government, it's very clear, has launched a full court press to try and bully or convince Canada somehow to collude in the 413 scheme and to really break its commitments to Ontarians who care about the environment. We need to remind, in particular, the federal government, MPs and cabinet, that it's their job to stop 413, that we're not buying the claim that it's provincial jurisdiction. In particular, pointing out that we know the federal government's climate obligations are incompatible with 413, and that protecting federal species at risk, fisheries and migratory birds, are incompatible with 413. These are all clear federal heads of jurisdiction. And it's very important not to let federal government MPs pass the buck. That's really what Ontario is trying to lay the groundwork for them to do. They are the ones out there pitching this idea that there's some deal already that prevents the federal government from redesignating or passing a new Impact Assessment Act. That is simply false. It's not true. And we need to make it clear to MPs that we know that. And we need to make it very clear that we understand that the Impact Assessment Act can easily be amended to support redesignation. So don't buy any stories that somehow, oh, the Supreme Court decision means we can't do it. We know that they can. It does not prevent the federal government from doing what it needs to. And it's important to pressure government MPs wherever you live, not just on the 413 route, because the power to do this, to ensure this happens, while it technically rests with the minister, ultimately, if they don't do the right thing, it will be a political decision imposed politically, which means that the power lies with the whole government and caucus. And in particular, it's worth noting that the finance minister, justice minister, the parliamentary secretary to the environment minister, who are all going to be vital in ensuring that the government does the right thing. These are all actually central Toronto MPs. So if you're a central Toronto MP, a central Toronto resident, it's very important to go after your MP. You don't need to go to your to the 413 route to protest. You can do a protest in your neighborhood, such as next weekend or on the 28th. There will be a protest in Eastland Park in Toronto, focusing on those Toronto MPs, pressuring them to redesignate. So you lean on your MP and make it clear to them that you'll hold them responsible if there's no redesignation. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Phil. So quickly, just to go through some of the other areas of federal responsibility, then I'm just going to do a bit of a summary and talk to you just quickly about areas of provincial responsibility, and then get into what next for all of us. So federal government also has responsibility for the Federal Species at Risk Act and the Fisheries Act, Migratory Birds Convention Act, and several others. Probably the most high profile for Highway 413 is the Species at Risk Act. We have 29 federally listed endangered species along this highway. Some of them are critically endangered, like this beautiful little critter here called the red-side dace, which is a brightly colored minnow, which only exists in a few streams remaining in Canada, many of them along the road of the Highway 413. I won't get into all the details of this, but the key thing that you need to know is the federal government has responsibility, legal responsibility to protect these species. And this highway will demonstrably destroy their ability to survive, especially some of the rarest and most vulnerable ones, like this particular fish, the red-side dace. I'm just including this map just because this shows that some of the critical habitat of this species has been mapped. You can see this red line here, and right through the middle of that red line, going over to the 400 around Kirby Road, is where the eastern reaches of the proposed 413 would go. So almost right over top of this river, and all in the headwater streams and wetlands that feed this river. So this is the case for many of these species, that this highway would be particularly destructive, and the federal government has a responsibility to protect them. I believe that in conversations with federal government that they do want to ensure that these species are protected. They also have indicated a willingness to redesignate this highway for an impact assessment, as Phil was describing. We also are in a good position going forward past the next provincial election. We have the 3 opposition parties committed to canceling this project, including Bonnie Crombie. I saw someone mentioning her in the side chat here. So we do have this commitment. This highway is not necessary, as we know, for transportation. It's really about enabling sprawl. It's not going to decrease transportation time. It's really just about opening up the areas west of Brampton and north of Brampton into Caledon for large-scale sprawl. We have much better demonstrated alternatives to this highway in the form of getting trucks off the 401 to make everyone's lives safer, and putting them on the 407, which will save truckers time, money, and diesel fuel, and make everyone's lives better. And we know we can do this for billions and billions of dollars cheaper than building this highway, and actually solve the transportation problem. And we could do it tomorrow because Highway 407 is already there. So we have lots of alternatives to this highway, and we also have ways of stopping it. So just briefly, because I know we're running into overtime, and I want to talk about what we can all do together to work on this this project to make sure this doesn't get to the approval process and get underway before we have a chance to have a government in power that will change their mind. I'm also not ruling out the fact that we could get the existing provincial government to change its mind. We have changed their mind when enough force was brought to bear on many other important issues, probably most significantly the Greenbelt. So maybe we'll change their mind, and if not, we'll change the mind of the next government that comes into power. So the last two things we want to cover is land expropriation. This is expensive, takes a lot of time. Phil, maybe you can just speak briefly to this, very briefly, maybe just a minute to explain people what's required with this. And then I'll just talk about the provincial environmental assessment, and then we'll get into what we can do together.
Well, I mean, the key piece here is that the Ontario government is doing everything in its power to prevent landowners who don't want to play along with C413 from resisting the expropriation of their land. So expropriation is a process where the government makes you sell the land to them. It takes the land, gives you some money in return. And the reality is many of the owners along the route want to do this, but owners who don't would ordinarily, historically, have been able to fight through a hearing of necessity, it was called, to refuse to give up their land, to argue that it wasn't necessary for the provincial government to take that land. Hearings of necessity have been taken away a couple of years ago. There were some technical requirements that made it seem like a full provincial environmental assessment would have been required to identify the need for this land in order to expropriate the land. But that requirement is proposed to be removed, or has been removed, through the Get It Done Act. So we have limited avenues to stop the expropriation of land. But what expropriation does, it's a real political barrier and negative story for the government, because there are landowners who don't want to give up their land, and it really is a pressure point for a government that's all about property rights on the face of things.
Thanks, Phil. And then just briefly, the provincial government has been running its own environmental assessment process. I won't get into all the details of this, but I think the key thing to remember here is that the one that they're currently running, they're promising to cancel it and replace it with a new one that is called the streamlined environmental assessment process for highways. We do not know what that will look like yet, or what its timelines will be. But I can tell you that a lot of us are engaging with political decision makers around a lot of these issues. The Ministry of Transportation itself has said to the federal government that they feel that there's very little chance of this highway actually getting built and getting underway before 2028 or 2029. So when you hear the premier say that he's going to have shovels in the ground, this is a done deal, don't bother fighting, stop complaining about it, this highway's going ahead. Remember that that's got about as much truth in it as his commitment and promise that the Greenbelt was going to be developed and he would never back down. We have lots of things to do here, lots of things to do together. And I'm just going to talk briefly here about what some of those things are that we can work together to take action. Remember this, folks? Tens of thousands of people, hundreds of rallies, rampant media coverage, Auditor General's report, Integrity Commissioner's report, an ongoing RCMP investigation. The same people, the same developers, the same scandal are driving this highway, and we need to do the same thing as we did then to stop it. So what are we going to do? Well, one of the things we can do, of course, is join a local group. We talked about how the federal government is going to be so instrumental in the decision-making around whether or not this highway is delayed and ultimately canceled. It's very, very important that you connect with your federal MP, especially if they're a Liberal member. And many, many, many of them in the Toronto and Greater Golden Horseshoe area are in the Liberal caucus. So it's important for you to talk to them. It's also worthwhile to talk to your MP, even if they're not. MPs are monitoring what issues are important, what issues are salient to their voters, what people are talking about. So it's still worth doing. That's very important. Another thing is very important is to get a lawn sign. We have new revised lawn signs that are available that you can get and put them in your on your front lawn or in your community, or help distribute them. You can join our listserv. That gives you frequent information, updates. There are many, many local organizations around the region that are working to oppose this highway. It's very important that you connect with them and connect with people in your community, or even form a new organization focused on stopping the 413 and spreading the word in your community. Next slide, please. We have, oh, skipped one there. We have some upcoming events on Yours to Protect weekend. We have a hike coming up in Nashville Conservation Reserve. I saw that Katie put the sign up in the chat. You can go there directly. You can find out more on the Environmental Defense website. We have a series of rallies going on later in the month on the dates indicated here. And we also have a town hall in Vaughan on May 9th, focused on local strategies to stop the 413. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, a little bit prematurely, since I didn't have the slide up, is that we do have some great new Stop the 413 lawn signs. And the link is in the chat, and you'll be able to find out where you can pick those up. There it is right there. And those are always a great way of showing community support. So now we want to provide some time for all of you to ask some questions of all of us. And I'm going to go to, if I can find it here, the place where Matt has been collecting them for me, and go through some of them. So I have one here. How likely is it that the new Impact Assessment Act will be passed? And how likely is it the federal government will redesignate? Well, I wish I had a magic answer to that, but I have maybe close to it, in that I was speaking with staff in a minister's office today, and they are hopeful that the new act will be passed by June. You may have heard that in the budget speech that the Deputy Prime Minister made, I guess a couple days ago now, that she indicated that the Impact Assessment Act would be included in the budget bill. And why that matters and why that's important, of course, is that a budget bill has to be passed by government when they introduce it. It's not a bill that can just languish. It's the one that gives them spending powers. So it will pass as part of the budget bill, or the government will fall. So the NDP is likely to support it, and the budget bill will pass. So we're likely to see to see a new Impact Assessment Act by June. And then when I asked directly, is redesignation possible? And they said, yes, it is. So I think that we really need to make it clear to our MPs that that's our expectation, that there will be a new process that all of us can participate in, that we can bring our concerns to, that has a public component to it, and looks at the science behind the issues related to the 413.
Tim, if I could just
Yeah.
chip in there, we've really kind of highlighted in particular the importance of MPs who are not necessarily on the 413 route, particularly in downtown Toronto, those key ministers. And that's why there's an event happening on the 28th of April. It's going to be a really good opportunity to lean on those MPs. It's in Toronto for Torontonians, specifically on them, not just stop the 413, specifically to redesignate 413. It's in East Lynn Park, subway accessible near Wayne State. So not competing with the other Protect weekend. Easy to get to if you're in Toronto.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, you're really breaking up again for some reason. Next federal election is another question. When is it? It is unknown when the next federal election will be. It will be sometime next year by everyone's guess, probably next spring or in the fall of October 2025, which is the last time that it can occur. The incoming government, if the government changes, of course, could cancel the federal impact assessment. That will always be in the discretion of the incoming government. So if it changes, they could cancel it for sure. Next question, has Ontario already started building? The answer to that is no. There has been no building going on out there. And it's very important for any of you who live anywhere near the highway and its proposed route. If you see anything, make sure everyone else knows, and in particular, get a hold of us. The federal government has the power to issue emergency orders to stop any construction that's proceeding within endangered species habitat that has not received permits. So if you see something, make sure that you tell us right away so that we can seek orders to immediately have the people that are doing that charged under federal legislation. Highway 407, could we buy it back or subsidize it? We could always buy it back. You may be interested to know, if you don't, that we now own 51% of Highway 407 ETR because it is owned by the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, which pays all of our pensions when we retire. It owns 51%. So that is a change that makes it more possible to change policy there, theoretically. So that's a positive change that's happened recently. Of course, the eastern end of the 407, once you get past the private portion of it, is actually owned by all of us. It's owned by the provincial government. So we could either buy it back and change the tolls, or we could just subsidize. And as many of you may know, we did a study with Eunomia Transportation Consulting, and we spent some time interviewing truckers and looking at the math and looking at the tolls that are paid in the 407. And it concluded that it'd be much cheaper to pay even the very high tolls on the 407, the high tolls that are charged to trucks, over a 30-year period than it would be to build Highway 413. So there's lots of options there. Are online form letters effective? Is it better to write a personal letter or make a call to your MP or MPP? The answer to that is that a personal letter or making a call is better, especially a call, but form letters are counted. People in MPs' offices are tracking issues, and if they're getting lots and lots of emails about a particular issue, they are reporting that to their member of parliament. But if you make a call, or even better, set up a meeting, that is going to be very memorable because they know most people won't do that. And they know when they get a call from one person or a demand for a meeting for a person, that means thousands of other people in their community feel the same way. Are there any particular local MPs that have been responsive to this issue? Yes, many. Many of the Liberal caucus have been very responsive and very opposed to this highway. And I think that's very important to remember. I couldn't list all of them on this call right now, but if you want to connect with us at our office, we can tell you what our interaction, what the opinions have been from MPs that we're aware of, and we can help you with that. Are there benefits to federal provincial working group on assessments and environmental studies? Yes, there can be. There's the idea of coordinating assessments makes really good sense. But as I mentioned, the Ontario government has put their entire environmental assessment process with regard to major highways into limbo. They said 3 years ago that they were going to replace it with what they call a new streamlined process. They have not yet done so. We do not know what that's going to look like. We do know that the federal system is fairly robust, requires overview and review of a lot of the things that you'd be concerned about building a highway. So whatever Ontario does, it needs to be at least as robust as that, and hopefully more so. And in the absence of that, then the federal government really needs to step in. Are there food security concerns with Highway 413? Absolutely. The highway itself would directly pave over 2,000 acres of very prime Class 1 farmland. And of course, the sprawl that it is going to enable is going to cause a massive change in the rural character of Caledon and the areas between Georgetown and Brampton. and facilitate the conversion of all those areas into large-scale sprawl, warehouse development, and single-family homes and other highways and hard surfaces. So massive impact on farmland, high-quality farmland, some of the best farmland in the world from this highway. What does the trucking industry think about the 407 plan? The Private Trucking Industry Association was very involved with us and our consultants, and are supportive of moving trucks off the 401 to the 407. If you think about it, it makes good sense, because if you are a trucker and you're looking to bypass the Greater Golden Horseshoe, the GTA, the 407 starts in Milton. It ends at Highway 115 over that goes up from the 401 to Peterborough. It would allow you to bypass the stop and start and gridlock of the 401, and that time that's saved, which I think we estimated as 80 minutes possibly for trucks, and all the fuel savings from not starting and stopping is money in the bank for the industry. So they'd be happy to do so. The reason they do not use the 407 right now is the tolls are so high that it drives them off the highway, keeps them off there, and makes them drive in the 401. So they would like to have the option of using that highway. What about the Bradford bypass? The Bradford bypass is also another highway just to the north. It would end at the 400 north of where the 413 would meet the 400. It would go eastward from there through the Holland Marsh and join the 404. And it is also very destructive. The Holland Marsh is one of the most important wetlands in eastern Canada. It will also contaminate the headwaters of the Holland River, which flows into Lake Simcoe, which is already under huge pressure from salt levels and other forms of pollution. Another highway that really requires a thorough review, and it hasn't had it. And someone mentioned, what specific federal laws should be invoked when you mention them to an MP? The Species at Risk Act, the Fisheries Act, the Migratory Birds Convention Act, Impact Assessment Act are all federal legislation that you might want to mention when you're talking to your MP in terms of responsibility for them. And Red Side Dace, if you want to read more about that, learn more about why those maps have been created, why those particular rivers are so important, you can Google Red Side Dace recovery strategy, and that will lead you to the federal government website that and document that has this recovery strategy there that tells you all about that particular fish, what it needs, and why these areas are being designated as critical habitat for this species. Any more questions coming up there, Matt? We don't have a lot more time. We're at 10:02, but I could probably answer a couple more.
I mean, there's a lot of comments in the chat. I think I've pulled most of the questions out for you, but
okay, let me see
if
here.
someone has a new question, you can ask it, but if not, I guess we'll wrap up shortly.
Okay. One thing, just in terms of pollution, that I think I saw a couple of comments about the pollution from the highway that maybe I'll just mention, because it's something that I think is really important. You know, one of the things that will happen when the highway is built, it's not just the damage from the actual building of the highway, of course. It will be a 400 series highway, so it will have salt put on it all the time, all winter. All of that will end up in all these streams. All the ground up particles from the tires will end up in all these streams coming off the bridges. And then, of course, all the surrounding area is going to be developed, so we'll end up with lots of pollution going into the rivers. We'll be producing a report probably in the next couple of months, looking at the three watersheds impacted here, the Humber, the Credit, and Etobicoke Creek. And the best remaining quality areas of habitat in those three river systems, which of course flow southward off the Greenbelt and the Oak Ridges Moraine down into Lake Ontario. The best sources of water, the highest quality habitat, the source of the clean water that flows south will be directly impacted by this highway. All of these rivers are going to be turned into just basically open sewers on the landscape if this highway and the associated development goes ahead. So I think that's really important to remember, that this highway is aimed at the best quality remaining habitat and farmland within these three very important watersheds in the region. Okay, so we are going to wrap up now. Thank you so much for attending. And remember to take action. Join a group, call or email federal and Liberal MPs as a priority, but talk to your MPs either way. Also talk to your MPPs and tell them that this highway is never going to go ahead. Get a new batch of 413 lawn signs for your community, with the flip side about opening up the 407 to traffic now so we can help solve gridlock and save ourselves a lot of money. Also, make sure that you find your lawn sign at a local pickup spot near you. We can connect you with those folks so you don't have to travel very far to get it. Join our listserv, talk to your friends and family. Make sure that you know everything there is to know about this highway so you can tell all of your friends and family and politicians when they come to your door, this highway is never going to get built and we're going to stop it together. Thanks so much, folks. Great to be here with you tonight. Take care and have a fantastic evening out there in the spring weather.